The maritime historian Edward Burke's book Bound for Australia, which deals exclusively with the sinking of the Tayleur at Lambay Island, has in it a collection of eyewitness accounts from the Illustrated London News, and they will be read now to you by Conor Evans.
The Loss of the Tayleur, from the Illustrated London News, 28th of January 1854. The Tayleur was designed expressly for the Australian passenger trade, to form one of Messrs. Pilkington and Wilson's celebrated White Star Line. She was 25,000 tons, new measurement, and was capable of carrying 4,000 tons of cargo. No expense had been spared in her construction and fitting up, and the general opinion was that she would prove a fast and safe sailer. Had justice been done to so fine a vessel, these expectations would probably have been realised. But if the prevailing statements are correct, the ship was undermanned when she left Liverpool, and to that fatal error, the sad catastrophe we have this week to relate must be mainly attributed. Throughout the whole of Friday, the weather was thick and hazy also, so that no observations could be taken. Early on Saturday morning the ship was under full sail, for which the captain was blamed by some of the passengers, who remarked that the crew could not take in so much sail in an emergency. As the day wore on, the weather became boisterous, and about 10 a.m. land was in sight. In order to avoid any possible danger, the ship's course was altered about 11:30, and she was hauled up 2 points to windward. It was whilst on this course, and in about half an hour after, that the man in the bows, on the lookout, cried out, "Breakers on the starboard bow." It was then blowing heavily and a high sea running. The helm was put hard to starboard, the sheets of the head sails let go, and every means taken to bring the ship around on a course free from the threatened danger. It was then impossible to see a cable's length from the vessel, and in about 20 minutes more she struck, with great violence, on a reef of rocks, running out from a creek right to the eastward bluff of Lambay Island. The shock was tremendous, shaking the vessel from stem to stern. She rose on the next wave and rove in rather broadside on, and when she struck again, still heaving, the sea made a clean breach over her amidships, setting everything on deck afloat. After 2 or 3 more shocks, the ship began to sink by the stern, and the scene of confusion and dismay that ensued baffles all description. Charles Edward Lee of Neenah. Mr. Charles Edward Lee of Neenah, Tipperary, was the second cabin passenger on board the Tayleur. In his own words, "After the steam tug left us off the Skerries, we ran at the rate of 16 knots for 4 hours with a fair wind from the northeast. About 2 o'clock the following morning the wind chopped around to the southwest. The captain gave the order to have the topsail reefed, but the crew being very inefficient, they were a considerable time before they could take in the reef. Captain Noble declared to the passengers in my presence that if he had known the description of the crew he had on board, he would have not put to sea with them." About 3 o'clock on Friday evening, the captain sent the third mate aloft to see what the seamen were doing. When the mate came down, he said, "There are 3 or 4 of those beggars lashed to the top, asleep." On Friday, we boxed about the channel all day with a headwind. At 12 o'clock on Friday night, Captain Noble, who had not gone to bed previously, gave charge of the ship to the first mate and went below. At this time, the vessel had been 7 hours on one tack. A seaman passenger and 4 or 5 of the second cabin passengers, including myself, came on deck and remonstrated with the first mate as to the danger of keeping the vessel so long on the one tack. The seaman passenger said he knew the Irish Channel pretty well, and we must be near the Irish coast. He begged of the mate not to keep the vessel so long on the one tack. During the conversation, Captain Noble came on deck, said he was master of the ship, and would allow no man to interfere. The seaman, who was a stout man, broke his leg jumping on the rock and is now in the Dublin hospital. He hoped that he had not made any remark that was impertinent, but as there were a great number of passengers aboard and he was one of them, he had a duty to perform. Captain Noble made no remark but turned away. We went below and remained there till Saturday morning. We then came on deck, and as the vessel was still sailing on the same tack, we remonstrated again with Captain Noble. He turned away and didn't answer. At 5 minutes past 12 on Saturday, we sighted land, which appeared to be about 3/4 of a mile ahead. Captain Noble then gave the sailors orders about the sails and called all the passengers to him. He said, "Now then, if you want to preserve your lives, you must come to these ropes and help us." And the passengers were all engaged for 20 minutes, pulling at the ropes and assisting the seamen. The vessel weathered one point off the island, but the second point she could not weather. When Captain Noble saw this, he gave orders to let go both anchors for the purpose of bringing the ship easy to the rock, from which we were only 30 yards distant. The weather anchor went down first, and the cable snapped in two. The lee next went down, and dragging, letting the stern of the vessel go on the shore first, and her bows a little off. She then grated on the ground. In about 25 minutes, the stern, up to midships, filled with water. At this time, no more than 25 passengers had reached the shore. The majority had jumped onto the rock. Mr. John Gibson of Cavan and myself, seeing that there was no other means of assisting our fellow passengers, got up to the forecastle, took hold of a spare spar, and forced one end onto the rock. We lashed the other end to the bulwarks of the vessel, and by means of this temporary bridge, we both landed and were followed by about 100 other passengers. As soon as we got ashore, we stood by the spar to prevent it being dragged from the rock by the motion of the ship. In about 15 minutes, the ship gave a tremendous lurch and dragged the spar off the rock, thus at once and forever cutting off all communication between the ship and the shore. After that, only 5 lives were saved, including that of Captain Noble. The captain was up to his waist in water in the stern of the ship before he attempted to leave the ship. He then pulled off all his clothes but his trousers and shirt, threw himself into the sea, and struck out for the shore. 2 young men were standing on the rock as he approached the shore, and they pulled him up. He got hold of a portion of the rock and held fast, but the next wave carried away the 2 young men who had assisted him, and they were drowned. Evidence of Edward Tew. Just as I came on deck, a lady came up to me and asked if I could swim. I told her I could. She was the same lady who afterward offered £3,000 for her life. She said she would keep near me. However, she went away, and I had been actively engaged from the time we first saw land. I had no time to be frightened. I was one of the few who kept their senses to the last. I went to the larboard side of the vessel, that's to say, the side furthest from the shore. I sat down for about half a minute and made up my mind to swim in a different direction in order to avoid the dead bodies. I then dropped quietly down a chain into the water and had not swum above a couple of yards when I saw a boy about 10 years old clinging to a piece of wood. I immediately made to him. He was crying and told me his mother was drowned. He said it was no use my trying to save him, for he would be drowned. However, I was determined to try, and accordingly took him by the collar and placed him on the top of the large spar and made him take hold of a piece of iron which was standing out. I still held on to his collar with my right hand and kept the broken pieces of wood and spars off with my left. It was then that I experienced difficulties which required almost superhuman effort to overcome. A heavy sea was rolling over us every moment. Large spars threatened to crash us, and almost perpendicular rocks as black as death staring us in the face. I was determined not to have our heads dashed against the rocks, as had been the fate of so many of my fellow passengers. As we neared the rocks, the boy was washed off the spar, but I held hold of him. I put out my hand to save our heads, and received a cut in the hand. But I felt the land and told the boy we were saved. But not so, for we were washed back out again. I made to land a second time and was washed back again. I tried a third time and was treated the same way. I was making toward the rock a fourth time, determined to save the lad or die with him, when a spar struck him on the right side of his head, the side I had no control over, and it entered his skull. It knocked me under at the same time, and I rose again, and a rope was thrown to me, which I twisted round my arm 20 times at least, and with the assistance of a sailor, clambered up the rock. I just got there in time to see the whole ship go down. I found the captain had arrived before me. He had swum ashore, and 2 passengers who assisted him out of the water were both washed back again into the sea and drowned. The captain said he could feel the dead bodies with his feet as he swam. Several other people were washed back into the sea in an attempt to save life. One Frenchman saved a child in the following manner. He had undressed to his shirt, intending to swim, but seeing so many die in the attempt, he chose rather to try the rope. But just as he was getting onto the rope, he saw a child sprawling upon the deck. He snatched it up, took hold of its back in his teeth, and carried it safely to the shore. The child is unowned. I believe I was the last man who left the ship, and the last to arrive safely on shore. There were only 2 persons who saved themselves by swimming besides myself, the captain and a passenger sailor. I found we were cast on Lambay Island, about 3 miles from Rush and about 13 from Dublin. Here you would see some limping with their legs sprained. One man had a broken arm, another man had only a shirt on, and another had only got a pair of trousers, while others were without shoes or stockings. It was here that I heard the most heart-rending tales. One man lost 6 sisters, 4 brothers, and a mother. A German had lost a whole family. Another man told me he had lost his brother, his brother's wife, her 3 sisters, and 4 children. Others had lost their wives and children. The loss of property was immense, and no one seemed to have insured. One man told me that he had about £750 worth of goods on board. They were not insured, but he had insured his life for £1,000. The night was dreadful. We were almost starving. Many of us were nearly naked and wet through. We had straw given to us to lie down upon. In this state we passed the night. The next day was as bad as the day before. When we went to the wreck, we found bodies piled over each other, all naked and mangled in such a way that no one could tell who they were. I helped some of the sailors down the rocks by a rope which was fastened around my waist. I then sat down and fixed my feet against a projecting piece of rock. In this way, I could have supported a bullock, and of course the rope could not slip from my hold. I was obliged to remain in this way for an hour, everyone declining to take my post. One man was good enough to cover my feet with sods to keep the cold off. There was one lady brought up the cliff. She was naked, all but her stays, and had 2 diamond rings on her fingers. I was later told, about a couple of hours later, after that some inhuman monster had cut her fingers off for the rings.